Good morning everybody, good morning, it's JPR and welcome back to another video. So normally on this channel I sit here and talk to you about my silly opinions, but today I'm gonna sit here and talk to you about your silly opinions. You may have noticed that over the past few weeks I've been posting on the community tab these Pokemon generation polls to see what everyone thinks of every generation. These polls received roughly 20,000 to 40,000 votes each, which while that's a very small slice of the larger Pokemon community, I feel like it's a good enough sample size to determine what the most popular generations really are. Plus, after like the first couple hundred votes or so, it seems like the percentages mostly stayed the same no matter how many people voted, so who knows, maybe I could have had 1 million people vote on each of these polls and the results still would have been almost exactly the same. But with that out of the way, let's get right into it. So first off, I know the Pokemon community has a pretty bad reputation for being aggressively negative online, but I'm happy to report that none of the 8 generations ended up being more negative than positive. Because hey, let's be real, if you identify as a Pokemon fan, you probably like most of the games since they are mostly the same. Let's be honest. So I just wanted to commend everyone. We proved that we're not all negative Nancys despite our many gripes. But anyhow, in last place with 43% positive reception and 15% negative reception, with the rest all falling in the middle, is Generation 1. Now, yeah, from a gameplay perspective, when you look at how broken some aspects of these games are, the lack of post-game material and other minor problems here and there, I do think these games are the weakest in the series. And hey, I'm like as anti-Gen 1er as you possibly can be. Well, let's ignore the fact that my favorite Pokemon is Arcanine for a minute. But yeah, anyway, I'm not a Gen 1er. But I will come to Gen 1's defense here, because I really don't think Gen 1 can be judged on the same playing field as future generations. Yes, it's broken in many aspects, but it's also the very first, and the majority of the things that we love about Pokemon, even today, were things laid down by this generation. I mean, a lot of it we take for granted, but honestly, Gen 1 actually gets a lot more right in its first attempt than it gets wrong. Which is why it's hard for me to sit here and say definitively that Gen 1 is the worst, because I think for its time, it's actually still rather brilliant. Now, some of this could definitely be attributed to people just being flat out sick of Pokemon pushing Gen 1 propaganda in recent years, but we also recently had both the 20th anniversary and the 25th anniversary, so naturally they're gonna promote Gen 1 Pokemon a little more heavily. They are the most iconic Pokemon, like them or not. Like, did I enjoy all the Alolan forms being from Kanto? No. And then I see Leon sneaking in the Gen 8 with a Charizard as his ace? Oh heck no, son, you better fix that! You know, I get it. It's easy to be tired of Gen 1 pandering at this stage, but I try not to let it affect my actual thoughts towards Gen 1 in its own time frame. I'm just spitballing potential reasons why modern audiences may have voted this one a bit lower. Now, coming in 7th place, jumping from the oldest generation to the newest, at least for another month, Generation 8. This one came in with a 53% positivity score and 14% negativity. Naturally, this generation not only received the highest amount of votes, but also generated the most discussion by far, with over 700 comments. Not that I read any of them because I value my sanity. Now, I said this in my own personal Gen 8 review a couple months ago, I feel like Gen 8 is the hardest generation to place on a list of them all. Because usually all the games from one generation are made in a distinct style, whereas the 3 different Gen 8 games could not possibly be any more different. Sword and Shield is your standard introduction to a new generation, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are classically inspired remakes, and Legends Arceus is possibly the most unique and off-the-wall Pokemon game we've ever gotten. So, naturally, opinions on this generation are going to be all over the place. I know mine certainly are, at least. I do think Legends Arceus helped tremendously, though. This was certainly the most negative attention any generation has gotten in the start, but it sort of rebounded at the end, I would say. Even with Sword and Shield, most people looked at the DLC very favorably, and I think it brought their overall perception of the game up. But of course, as mentioned earlier, people are still incredibly opinionated about Generation 8. It's hard to really say much more about it because I think that part of determining how good a Pokemon generation is in how it ages. Oftentimes, it takes 5, maybe even 10 to 15 years before we really see any real consensus set in. Which is honestly one of my favorite things about Pokemon, seeing how the discussion shifts as certain aspects become more appreciated, while some flaws may become more apparent. So even though we're about to move on to Gen 9 at this current point in time, I expect that the discussion revolving around Generation 8 is far from over. In 6th place is Generation 7, coming in with 57% positive feedback and 11% negative. I feel like Gen 7 had the opposite trajectory that Gen 8 did. When Sun and Moon first launched, I remember nearly everyone applauded it as one of the best Pokemon games. Maybe people were just high on the whole 20th anniversary celebration, but as time progressed, people certainly grew more resentful of Gen 7. This was probably due to Sun and Moon's lack of replay value due to it being a very dialogue and tutorial heavy game, the existence of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon making people replay said non-replayable game once again with very minimal additions to the main story, and of course Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee being a second pair of Kanto remakes in a time where we were already being smothered by Gen 1 fan service. I think this is ultimately what tarnished Gen 7's reputation in the long run. But clearly there are still a lot of people who adamantly love Gen 7. I personally like the Alola games a lot despite the sluggish pacing, and I would even go as far to say that Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are some of the best modern Pokemon games. It's just that the timing of their release was rather unfortunate, and definitely it would have been much more appreciated as a Switch game instead of another 3DS title. But again, the aging process is part of every gen's reception, and I think people are starting to come back around on Gen 7 a little bit. And rounding out the bottom half of this list, in 5th place is Generation 2, Gold, Silver, and Crystal, with 65% positive feedback and 10% negative. Now, some sharp-eyed individuals may have noticed that I posted the Gen 2 poll before the Gen 1 poll, and that's because originally this video was going to be about Gen 2's fall from grace with the fandom over the past few years. Because I remember for a long time, both in my real-life friend circles and in my first few years in the online community, Gen 2 was almost universally considered the gold standard for Pokemon. Pun not intended. But over the past few years, it seems like this is now one of the most openly criticized generations. And yes, while being a direct continuation of Gen 1 with 16 gym badges and fighting red on Mount Silver was incredibly dope for its time, it definitely made other aspects of the Johto region age like milk relative to any other gen, including Gen 1. But unfortunately, the data I collected did not support my thesis, so I had to scrap that video idea and accept the fact that I may just have social media brain rot. Or maybe it's because I didn't specify in this poll that Heart Gold and Soul Silver aren't actually part of Gen 2, so maybe that swayed some people to be more positive? I'm not sure. Regardless, while Gen 2 does have some of the most easily recognizable flaws in all of Pokemon, particularly when it comes to the lack of good team building options and the extreme lack of EXP among other things, these games certainly were technical marvels for their time. Just the fact alone that they managed to fit 2 regions onto one Game Boy Color cartridge is very impressive. I certainly understand the viewpoint that Gen 2 is more quantity over quality, but it still included some really cool stuff along the way. I am a bit shocked to see it ranked this high, but for sure it's no longer the generation that gets lifted up on a pedestal like it used to. The 4th spot belongs to Generation 6, with 72% having a favorable impression of this gen and 5% disliking it. Like Gen 2, this one also shocked me because it likewise feels like one of the most openly berated generations. Part of that was definitely me though. But as I said in a video I previously made this year, although I'm personally not a fan of Gen 6, it certainly is a very important generation. If you didn't watch that video, in a nutshell, my argument is that Gen 6's entire premise wasn't that it was supposed to be good for its time, rather it was about setting up Pokemon for a better long-term future when they jumped to 3D. Whether or not this gen succeeded lies entirely in your opinion of Gen 7 and 8 though. I'm not gonna get into those weeds. While this is certainly not the most polished generation, it did introduce a ton of new mechanics that have in some way or another persisted into the current day. In a way, this was really the generation that modernized Pokemon. And I believe this gen easily has the best multiplayer of them all. Well, at least until Scarlet and Violet comes out. Game Freak really said, yo, the PSS is kind of fire. Delete it. It definitely used to get more flack than it does now, but it is almost a decade old, which is typically the point where nostalgia sets in for every generation and that generation skyrockets in popularity. Believe me, this has happened for literally every generation prior to Gen 6 as well. It's like a very delayed honeymoon period. And finally, we've arrived at the top 3. These 3 generations were incredibly close together, being separated by only a few percentage points each. To kick off the podium in 3rd place with a whopping 89% positive reception versus 3% negativity, we have Gen 5. While initially somewhat divisive on launch due to the larger emphasis on the story and a completely overhauled Pokédex, following the release of Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, a game that balanced a large dex with great exploration and a good follow-up to said story, Gen 5 has certainly turned into a fan favorite. One of this gen's greatest strengths is certainly in its willingness to be brand new in almost every area, despite being the first gen to not make the jump to a new console. It's the only gen to not contain a remake or a 3rd version of any kind, so it feels very light on filler content relative to all the rest. A lot of people believe that Gen 5 was widely hated upon release, but nostalgia is what turned it into a fan favorite, but honestly, not really. These games were very well received on the release, aside from a small number of aforementioned fans who didn't like the new direction Black and White went in. But certainly it seems that as these games have aged, more people who were initially on the fence have come to appreciate this gen's many strengths. But with that, we've reached the top 2. Both of these generations have an even 92% of people who like them, and a measly 2% that dislike them. So the tiebreaker comes from the amount of people who voted it's great versus it's pretty good. So coming in second is none other than Generation 3. Another gen that, despite being 20 years old at this point, has held up remarkably well. Whether it's Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, or the remakes of Fire Red and Leaf Green, this gen delivers on two very different but two very solid experiences. I've gone back to replay these relatively recently, and I'll be real, they still feel like newish games. The only vital thing missing from the experience, I would say, is the physical special split. It's pretty remarkable because it seems like almost everyone who was in that nostalgic honeymoon period around 2011 to about 2014 who shouted "Hoenn confirmed" at the mere mention of water has kind of faded away. And yet, this gen still maintains a very solid status among the fandom. At this point, I think Gen 3 has proven that it actually stands on its own 2 feet, even with the nostalgia goggles off. Which of course leaves only one. Just narrowly squeaking out the victory is Gen 4, which is still riding high despite remake media no longer being in season. Now, it's certainly hard to argue that Gen 4 isn't the nostalgic favorite right now. I would say, based on my own analytics and observations, most people in the online community right now started with Gen 4, so of course it's going to be a sentimental favorite. Though, I don't think it's just nostalgia that carried Gen 4 to this victory. It certainly is one of the most solid generations all around, if you don't count Diamond and Pearl because Platinum exists, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver are still widely considered the series' best remakes. So whether you're a fan of the new stuff this generation had to offer or the old stuff with a new coat of paint, you're well covered. It's easy to see why this generation has the most widespread appeal, at least according to this poll. But honestly, I would say that the top 3 are so close together that if several thousand more people voted, it could easily change. So the top 3, in my opinion, are very easily interchangeable. I mean, I guess these YouTube polls technically never end unless I literally delete them, so I guess they still can change? It just won't be updated in this video. So there you have it, that is every Pokemon generation ranked not by me, but by the fans. So if you have a problem with it, please settle it amongst yourselves. But before the comments turn into nuclear war down below, I ask that you please leave a like in this video if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you haven't already. I think you're gonna like it here. And as always, a big shout out to the channel members. Thank you guys so much for your constant support, and I'll see you guys next time.